Chapter 16. Why us? Why was our lineage the one that crossed the threshold of cumulative cultural evolution to enter into a long period of culture-driven genetic evolution? Why did this process only begin in the last few million years? Why not 10 or 200 million years ago? And why haven't other species experienced similar culture-gene coevolutionary trajectories? The first thing to realize is that our species is probably not the only one whose brains and bodies have been shaped by the importance of social learning. Biologists and primatologists like Kevin Laland, Andy Whiten, Carl von Schaik, and their collaborators have made the case that the evolutionary expansion of brains in many species has been influenced by the tendency of social learning to spread useful behaviors, like tool use and food choices, through populations. Through some combination of individual experience, behavioral flexibility, and social learning, animals with larger brains survive and reproduce more effectively in new environments and can solve more novel problems. Species with bigger brains have higher rates of behavioral innovation and do more social learning. Because bigger brains are costly to develop and program, this approach also explains why bigger-brained species tend to have extended childhoods, juvenile periods, and longer lives. Bigger brains require longer childhoods in order to permit offspring enough time for learning. They also require longer lives for mothers, so they can both care for their offspring during these extended childhoods and still have enough time to have more offspring. So, in one sense, our species is just part of a larger pattern created by an evolutionary process that helps explain why some species have bigger brains than others do. But don't worry, in another sense, we are still quite special. In no other living species has this process sparked substantial cumulative cultural evolution and the autocatalytic culture-gene interaction that has powerfully driven our genetic evolution. The reason why other species haven't experienced this may lie in a kind of startup problem. Once cumulative cultural evolution is up and running, it can create a rich cultural world full of adaptive tools, techniques, and know-how that can more than pay the costs of building and programming up a larger brain designed and equipped for cultural learning. However, in the beginning, there won't be much out there to culturally acquire, and what is there will be simple enough that it will still be learnable by one's own individual learning efforts, without social learning, by trial and error, for example. Thus, natural selection may not favor larger brain size or complexity, because brains are costly to develop and program. And even if the costs of brain expansion are manageable, natural selection will then tend to invest in improving animals' individual, asocial learning abilities, since individual learning allows innovation and behavioral flexibility even when no one else around is doing anything worth learning, when social learning isn't useful. Moreover, by improving individuals' abilities to learn on their own, from their environment, natural selection also improves those particular forms of social learning that are parasitic on individual learning, in which individuals are exposed to tools and resources, for example, termites, by hanging around others, but then figure out how to use the tools or access the resources on their own. When natural selection acts on individual learning, it increases some simple forms of social learning to a certain degree as a byproduct. Thus, the startup problem means that the conditions under which there's enough cumulative culture to begin driving genetic evolution are rare, because early on there wouldn't have been enough of an accumulation to pay the costs of bigger brains. And if there had been, The most adaptive investment would be in improved individual learning, not better social learning or eventually cultural learning. So in order for natural selection to favor improved social learning, there has to be a lot of cultural stuff to learn. But if you don't have much social learning, there's unlikely to be much of an accumulation out there to tap. To circumvent the startup problem, you need to somehow get so much accumulated know-how into the minds and behaviors of others that individual learning, even with its indirect effects on simple social learning, can't do the job of keeping up with much better social learners. The startup problem explains why we don't see other species with substantial cumulative cultural evolution. It's also why there is a Rubicon, which needs crossing, rather than a convenient evolutionary entrance ramp onto the culture-gene coevolutionary highway. Now, the question is, specifically, how did we first jumpstart the cumulative cultural evolutionary engine? Momentarily, I bulldoze ahead and lay out the best account I have come up with, which fits the current balance of the evidence. However, this view of human evolution is new enough that my account must remain rather speculative. I'm confident that my many fine colleagues will correct my inevitable mistakes in the future. Two intertwined pathways create a bridge. There are two evolutionary pathways around the startup problem. First, as I mentioned, if we can somehow expand the size and complexity of a species' cultural repertoire without altering its brain size, then there will be more good adaptive stuff in the world to learn from others. If that happens, then having genes that improve social learning will pay for themselves, because there will already be plenty of stuff out there to socially acquire. Or we can somehow lower the costs of bigger brains. These costs are in part actually incurred by the mother, since she has to supply longer periods of care while her offspring are booting up that bigger brain for life as an adult. I think both of these avenues were important and were mutually reinforcing. One diagram sketches the major causal connections in the know-how pathway, the first of these pathways. Another diagram overlays the sociality care pathway. Note that these diagrams only sketch the major causal connections, so some of the connections described are not depicted. I'll begin by discussing why starting with a large ground-dwelling primate is important, then add predation and intergroup competition to this, and finally bring in fluctuating environments. These three exogenous factors sparked the evolutionary processes that run through our two intertwined pathways. Now, let's examine the two pathways. Large, ground-dwelling primates produce bigger cultural accumulations. Primates evolved hands for eating and hanging around in trees as well as for traveling. But when they descend from the trees to the ground, the possibilities created by having hands open up. For some primates, spending time on the ground, terrestriality, fosters the development of more tool types and more complex tools, and a greater spread of those skills by social learning. The advantages of terrestriality favoring this are straightforward. On the ground, individuals can have both hands free and often have greater access to more types of resources, such as insects, for example termites and ants, nuts, stones, sticks, reeds, grasses, various leaves, and water. Without both hands and various items at the ready, tools with different parts or procedures involving multiple tools or steps are harder to figure out. This is clear for chimpanzees who are semi-terrestrial. The tools and procedures they use on the ground are typically more complex than those they use in the trees. And their few complex tree tools are merely reapplications of tools first developed and practiced on the ground. In addition, on the ground, individual learners have access to more individuals more easily and with less obstructed views. As a result, by hanging around others on the ground, they are more likely to figure things out individually. They can also benefit from tools left lying around by others, which primates readily pick up and monkey around with. In the trees, by contrast, tools typically fall to the ground and thus can't spark learning in other tree dwellers. The advantages of terrestriality can be seen by comparing the degree of tool use among living primates in situations that encourage or compel them to spend more time on the ground. These include both natural experiments in the wild and comparisons with primates in captivity. Monkeys, for example, generally don't use tools. However, when forced into habitats with few trees, where they must spend more time on the ground, monkeys are more likely to start using tools. Among apes, captive orangutans spend more time on the ground than they do in the wild, and they use tools more frequently and make more complex tools. In the wild, this may also explain why the tools of largely tree-dwelling orangutans are typically less complex than those of chimpanzees, who spend much more time on the ground. Here, the effects of spending time on the ground augment the advantages large apes already have over other primates in solving problems on their own, for example, by figuring out how to make tools. So all other things being equal, bigger-brained primates figure out more stuff that a good social learner might benefit from, and bigger-brained primates who live on the ground generate even more such useful stuff. Remember, we are looking at the conditions under which there might be enough valuable information contained in the behaviors of others in one's group that natural selection will start favoring larger cultural brains. Fossil evidence from the likely ancestors of Australopiths indicates that a move out of the trees and onto the ground was well underway by 5 million years ago. By 4.4 million years ago in Africa, there were apes with chimpanzee-sized, or a bit smaller, brains who were adept at both walking on the ground and clambering in the trees. Based on brain size and terrestriality, we'd expect these apes to be good individual learners, and because they have a lot of ground time, they should have a decent repertoire of learned behaviors and skills, perhaps not much different from that of chimpanzees. If some other factor were to increase this terrestrial ape's brain size to match that of chimpanzees, then we'd expect a richer cultural world than observed in chimpanzees due to this ape's greater terrestriality, more ground time, more tools. More access to others on the ground will influence the presence of know-how, due to the increased opportunities for social learning. Large-brained apes will have at least some limited social learning abilities because they come free as a byproduct of selection for individual learning. More know-how and more opportunities for social learning will increase the strength of natural selection for genes that make individuals more capable of using social learning to take advantage of this situation. Improved social learning eventually demands larger brains and longer childhoods. Predation favors larger groups, which favor greater cultural accumulations. Increased terrestriality would have exposed these apes to greater danger from predators, as trees are where primates go to avoid many dangers. In Africa, our early ape ancestors would have faced substantially bigger dangers from predators than any modern jungle-dwelling ape, aside from the dangers posed by humans. The number and variety of large carnivores at this time was about twice that of current levels. On top of the lions, leopards, cheetahs, and hyenas of today, there were several big saber-toothed cats, including two the size of lions and one that probably specialized in ambush hunting from dense vegetation. There were also wolf-like wild dogs and other still-living species of hyenas hunting in packs, as well as an increasing number of venomous snakes. In addition, as we discussed for chimpanzees in Chapter 10, other ape groups may have created a further predatory threat, as different groups competed for access to fruit trees, recent kills of large game, defensible caves, valuable stone tools, or quarrying sites. And since we eventually see multiple species of australopiths, there might have been predation from other ape species as well. Faced with increased predation, mammals often respond behaviorally by forming larger groups, since there's safety in numbers. This behavior suggests that our ancient ancestors might have formed larger groups as a defensive tactic, since they spent more time on the ground. As a byproduct of this defensive strategy, larger groups might have caused an increase in the size and complexity of toolkits, skills, and learned bodies of know-how, as larger groups generated, spread, and preserved more innovations and ideas. Further fueling the same effect, the pressure from predators could have also suppressed the broad dispersal of individuals for foraging that we see in living apes. By inhibiting dispersals, young apes in the group would have gained more intensive access to more individuals. Overall, the increase in the number and complexity of the tools and of types of local know-how, including how to find, extract, and process high-quality foods and to access water, created by these effects, would have increased the selection pressures for building brains better at acquiring, storing, organizing, and retransmitting this cultural information. These abilities would have favored larger brains and longer developmental periods, childhood, for learning all the information available. Shifting environmental conditions favor more social learning. As the aforementioned evolutionary processes were unfolding, climatic shifts were causing environmental conditions to fluctuate more rapidly. Mathematical models of evolutionary processes show that a greater reliance on social learning over individual learning is favored when environments destabilize and begin changing over centuries or millennia. After about 3 million years ago, the climate became increasingly variable and showed systematic patterns of cycling until about 10,000 years ago. This pattern suggests that climatic fluctuations intensified the selection pressures for social learning, as forests, lakes, savannas, and woodlands repeatedly expanded and contracted as the world became generally cooler and drier. Shifting environments would have given our reliance on social learning a first kick between 2 and 3 million years ago, which is when our genus emerged. Of course, this kick would have impacted many species, so alone it can't explain why our lineage crossed the Rubicon. But with this kick in mind, let's return to the unfolding evolutionary process. The sociality care pathway. While the combination of fluctuating environments and the enrichment of the cultural repertoires created by larger terrestrial groups might be enough to cross the critical threshold, that is, create feedback loop D, there remains an important obstacle. To create bigger-brained primates, moms need to invest more time and energy in gestation, lactation, and care for their offspring while they are growing up and doing all that social learning and practicing to tap into the cultural pool of know-how. This means that mom will have to somehow obtain more calories and increase the spacing between her births so she can care for each offspring longer while they are learning. To accomplish this, She will have to live longer. Otherwise, she will have fewer total offspring. We can see natural selection operating in this way in living apes. Chimpanzee moms have to nurse for 5 years, and so have 5 to 6 years between births. The problem is that species who push this too far are more likely to go extinct when droughts, diseases, floods, or famines, shocks, hit that increase adult mortality rates because the population can't recover fast enough from the shock. For example, if females need to live to an average age of 30 years for a population to reproduce itself, and a drought suddenly pushes the average age of death down to 20 years, the population will start shrinking and may disappear entirely. So, as natural selection pushes brain sizes up to increase individual fitness, it makes the species more vulnerable to extinction from shocks. This sets a limit to how far natural selection can increase brain sizes by reallocating a mother's efforts and extending her life. Modern apes are probably up against this limit. There is, however, a workaround, and it's conceptually simple. Other individuals have to help mom raise her kids. If a mother can get some help, she need not space her births so far apart or worry about getting enough calories for herself. For our lineage, an evolutionary pathway to this solution opened up once groups got larger and began to rely a bit more heavily on social learning. Pair bonding, social learning, and families. Increasing group size and social learning about local resources may favor pair bonding strategies by both males and females. Let's first focus on the effects of group size. In many species, males use force or coercion against other males to secure as many mating opportunities with as many females as they can. A male's dominance ranking is the primary predictor of his mating success and long-term fitness. However, as the density of males increases in a group, the payoffs from using dominance go down, since males have to fight off more competitors and keep track of more females. When this happens, one strategy males can pursue in light of the increased competition in larger groups is pair bonding. As I explained in Chapter 9, in using pair bonding strategies, males seek to develop ongoing dyadic relationships with females by offering things like meat, protection for her and her offspring, and potentially care for her offspring. In exchange, he gets preferred sexual access to her and more reliable knowledge about her cycles so he knows when she can get pregnant. Although, of course, this means he has to hang around her, at least sometimes. Intriguing evidence for the effect of group size on the emergence of pair bonding has been gathered for the Ngogo chimpanzee group discussed in Chapter 10. As noted, the Ngogo group is unusually large compared to typical wild chimpanzee troops. Due perhaps to the intensified competition of the larger group, detailed analyses of male and female movements across their large territory indicate that some males and females are moving around in pairs. This is odd, since chimpanzees are notoriously not pair bonders. Genetic studies show that these paired males got to preferentially father the offspring of the female he was with. These pairs tended to be relatively physically close to one another and groomed each other. The effects of these relationships were often enduring, with one male fathering 3 of a female's 4 offspring over 16 years. While only about 1/4 of males engaged in this pairing behavior, about half of females did. The community has more males than females. Not surprisingly, it wasn't the dominant males who used this relationship-building strategy, and dominance rank remained an important determinant of male fitness. Nevertheless, these observations suggest that the seeds of pair bonding may begin to sprout when groups get large. Now, let's consider how the social learning abilities of large apes influence matters. Social learning means that males may come with a kind of cultural inheritance that may be of value to females. In chimpanzees, males remain in their home group, where they grew up, whereas females are generally immigrants. Analyses show that male chimpanzees tend to follow the foraging patterns of their mothers and may well have acquired tips about when and where to find food in their territory and how to extract it. Thus, by hanging out with a locally experienced male, females get access to his local knowledge. Actually, his mom's. In general, in a species with social learning skills in which females arrive from other groups, males have something to offer: local knowledge. This means that females should choose males who were particularly good social learners while growing up, and then hang around them for extended periods to learn. Thus, in a large ape group in which females are immigrants, females will benefit from pair bonding by getting access to local knowledge, along with the usual protection, food, etc., and males will benefit from pair bonding by mitigating fierce male-male competition. And males who are particularly good social learners may disproportionately benefit, since they will be preferred by females shopping for quality local knowledge. So here's where we are now. Predation favors the evolution of larger, less diffuse groups, which in turn favors the spread of a pair bonding strategy as a response to the increased density of individuals and the social inheritance of local knowledge. Next, let's examine how pair bonding extends the circle of kinship in apes. Pair bonding in large primate groups will increase the recognition of blood relatives, particularly siblings, half-siblings, fathers, and perhaps fathers' brothers, uncles. The primatologist Bernard Chappé argues that this happens because primates primarily, though not entirely, figure out who their relatives are by noting who else is hanging around Mom. Mom, of course, is unmistakable. She's the one you nurse from. In living great apes, this approach to identifying relatives doesn't produce very much usable kinship. To see why, consider a male chimpanzee. Growing up, he will meet only those brothers or sisters who are close to him in age, though many of these will actually be his half-siblings from different fathers. Any sisters or half-sisters he meets will soon leave to permanently emigrate to another group, and he likely won't see them again. His brothers, as soon as they are old enough, will head out to be with other males, presumably to start learning how to be a successful male, and begin building important alliances with other males. So our young male will see his brothers and half-brothers later in life, but he may not recognize them unless they were close to him in age. He can't spot his grandmothers, since his mother's mother lives in another group, and he has little hope of identifying his father's mother or any of his paternal relatives, since he has little way to determine who his father is. He and his mom will be lifelong kin, but he won't have that much interest in her because she doesn't know how to be a successful male, being a female and all, and she isn't a good choice for mating. Now consider a similar ape group, but now with pair bonding. Using the same hangs around mom rule, young apes can identify their likely father because he's now hanging around their mom, and father will be able to both identify his offspring and feel more confident that they are actually his offspring. Young males now may want to join their older brothers and start hanging around their father to learn about how to be a successful male. When this first begins to unfold, a father won't invest in his offspring. but he will at least tolerate them, since by getting to hang around him and observe him under his protection, they will have an edge later on. Through their association with their father, young males will now also be able to identify both their paternal half-brothers — their father may have other pair bonds — and their father's brothers, since the father will hang around his brothers and will tolerate offspring from any of his pair bonds. Because Dad's mother knows her son, she can now locate her grandchildren. She can watch which females her son is around and which little ones he tolerates. Overall, pair bonding holds the potential to transform a few scattered kin-based relationships into something that looks more like a family or a kin network. At some point in all this, females began to evolve what researchers call concealed ovulation or ovulatory crypsis. In many primates, such as chimpanzees, female bodies unmistakably signal when they are sexually receptive and capable of getting pregnant, sometimes using shiny buttock swellings. This means that once a male has hung around a female long enough, he'll know her cycle, and thus know when it's safe to head off to find some more receptive females, or build alliances among males. In humans, however, females are potentially sexually receptive all the time, and males cannot reliably predict when their mate can get pregnant. So, by concealing ovulation at least partially, males are forced to be around their mates more often than they would otherwise, and end up engaging in a lot of reproductively unnecessary sex. As a byproduct, this extra hanging around his mate will further solidify his relationships with any offspring who are hanging around their mother. Social learning, and later cultural learning, enhances the effects created by pair bonding and kinship. Think about it like this. A social learner watches how mom responds to and behaves toward various other individuals. The offspring copies mom's actions and potentially her feelings and emotions toward these other individuals. If mom treats a new infant with care and feeding, then an older sister might copy mom and provide care and feeding to the infant as well. If mom expresses kindness toward dad and grooms him, then our young learner feels more positive toward this male as well. If nothing else, daughters may copy mom's practices of hanging around dad, which will put her in contact with her brothers. Meanwhile, a male, once he has identified his father via mom, may copy his father's tendency to hang out with his brothers and his other offspring, thus effectively locating his uncles, brothers, and half-brothers. With more sophisticated cultural learning, a young male will copy his father's feelings toward his associates, which may put him in contact with his father's alliance partners. If his father invests in or protects mom and his sisters, then sons may copy these investing or protective acts or attitudes. Of course, as we discussed in Chapter 4, once natural selection begins to improve and hone cultural learning, learners will update their cultural beliefs, preferences, and strategies from more successful and prestigious individuals. Expanding one's recognized network of kin also means that learners will now have more opportunities for social learning. This is because the affection, or even merely social tolerance, fostered by recognized kin relations allows learners to comfortably stay around older, more knowledgeable individuals and watch what they do. At the same time, these older individuals now have incentives to make what they know available to these youngsters. That is, teaching and the use of communicative cues in cultural transmission. Reference Chapter 13. Increasing opportunities for social learning will increase the strength of natural selection for social learning, which can generate more useful, learnable knowledge. Help for mother and the division of information. A combination of pair bonding and a greater reliance on social learning will create both an expanded circle of kinship with more enduring relationships and greater alloparental care for offspring. Alloparental care refers to situations in which individuals besides the mother help care for offspring. In non-humans, alloparents include relatives who have kin-based incentives to help and non-relatives who are under coercive threat or have no other better option for survival. Among hunter-gatherers, alloparents include an offspring's father, or fathers, reference chapter 9, sisters, brothers, aunts, and grandparents from both sides, as well as the mother's friends. Detailed studies of alloparental care in 8 small-scale societies show that mothers do only about half of the direct child care. Of the remaining 50%, siblings and grandparents cover about half of that, with fathers, aunts, and everyone else picking up the final quarter. By contrast, other ape mothers do nearly 100% of the direct care. In some human foragers, though not all, aunts, grandmothers, and some others even do 10% to 25% of the breastfeeding. Pair bonding means that many relatives who previously would have had little or no recognition of their relatedness can now identify and build relationships with each other. Synergistically, social learning means that anyone who copies mom, like her daughters or younger sisters, will care for the infant in the way mom does. For fathers, knowledge of these kin relationships also means they will now have reason to protect the mother and her offspring. Sons, seeking to learn how to be a successful male, will apprentice with their fathers, or later with other males, and learn to protect and care for family members in adaptive ways. Greater social learning also means that young parents and alloparents can rapidly tap into the know-how of prior generations for finding and extracting valuable food sources, such as meat, insects, nuts, water, honey, and underground tubers, to help supply the extra energy needed for the lengthened period of a child's development. More sophisticated social learning also means that various females have incentives to help mom with her offspring. Less experienced females gain opportunities for observation and practice with infants, which they can later put to use in caring for their own infants. And mom will be much more inclined to allow others to stay around and learn if they are pitching in. Once social learning becomes selective, the more successful and prestigious mothers will get more help, as learners seek them out as models and care for their children as a form of deference. Reference chapter 8. Meanwhile, grandmothers may be inclined both to provide direct care for their grandchildren and to demonstrate to the mother how it's done, teaching. As noted in earlier chapters, grandparents have amassed a wealth of experience and knowledge, and once social learning improves, the door opens and they have a means to bequeath this cultural inheritance to their children and grandchildren. This happens provided that they can locate those grandkids, which is the evolutionary door that pair bonding opens. In thinking about what inexperienced girls and young women might learn from mothers and grandmothers, it bears underlining just how dependent humans are on cultural learning for what should be basic mammalian functions. Human mothers, for example, have to be taught how to breastfeed properly by latching the infant in a way that prevents the infant from biting through the nipple. Similarly, without cultural transmission, many mothers are inclined to toss away the viscous yellowish fluid that secretes from their breasts after birth before the milk arrives. This valuable fluid, colostrum, plays a number of important biological roles, including helping improve an infant's immune system. Nevertheless, many humans intuitively perceive colostrum as sour milk, which should not be given to infants. Other species do not make this serious mistake. Of course, later in human evolution, alloparenting would have become increasingly influenced by social norms. For example, among Hadza hunter-gatherers, the evolutionary anthropologist Alyssa Crittenden tells of a young girl who was repeatedly scolded because she refused to assist a mother with her baby. Not only was the young girl scolded by the mother, to whom she wasn't related, but she was ostracized by the other children until she complied with requests for help with infant care. Thus, social norms help explain why more distantly related and unrelated people supply 20% to 30% of direct child care in small-scale societies. The convergence of cultural learning and alloparenting gives rise to a synergy between the psychological abilities for caring for others and for cultural transmission. Both are enhanced by mentalizing or theory of mind, reference chapter 4, and by greater prosociality. Alloparents will be more effective when they can assess the desires, beliefs, and goals of those in their care, and are motivated to meet those needs. Recent experimental work across 14 primate species confirms this by showing that those species with more intensive alloparenting are more proactive in helping their group mates. Like alloparents, cultural learners need to infer the goals, desires, beliefs, and strategies of those they are learning from. And teachers, who are often alloparents engaged in cultural transmission, will be aided by the ability to assess what learners know and what they don't, as well as by the inclination to instruct them. Thus, the more intensive alloparenting became, the better equipped a species would be to culturally learn, and vice versa. The evolution of better cultural learning capacities would enhance parenting and alloparenting by sharpening mind-reading abilities and shaping pro-social motivations. The combination of 1. An increasing reliance on social learning, and 2. The emergence of pair bonding and alloparenting may explain the emergence of the division of labor between men and women. However, the key to understanding the division of labor is to recognize that it's rooted in a division of information. As cultural information begins to accumulate such that no one individual can know everything, pair-bonded couples can specialize in complementary bodies of culturally acquired skills, practices, and knowledge. Female hunter-gatherers, by virtue of birthing, lactating, and providing primary care for babies, need to focus on learning about infant handling, nursing, weaning, food preparation and processing, and any foraging skills that guarantee a steady flow of calories. Males, by contrast, can specialize in know-how about tool-making, defense, weapons, hunting, and tracking. This division of information can be observed in many small-scale societies. Among the Hadza, for example, the anthropologist Frank Marlowe tells of a time he went with 3 adolescent males to dig up some tubers, a task usually done by women. The trio gathered the tubers, and then they, plus Frank, ate them raw. Soon they all got sick. It turned out that the boys either misidentified the tubers or didn't realize that those particular tubers required cooking first. Apparently, this never happens when Hadza women are on the job. Similarly, Fijian men don't know all the fish taboos that protect women and infants against ciguatera poisoning during pregnancy and nursing, and my male professor pals usually don't know about colostrum. Our biases in social learning mean that at least initially these specializations will be acquired by focusing on and learning from either more successful males or more successful females, the same-sex bias we discussed in Chapter 4. However, culture gene coevolution may eventually have endowed males and females with different content biases, making them differentially more or less interested in learning about distinct topics. For example, girls might tend to be more interested in infants, whereas boys might tend to be more interested in projectiles. Supporting this possibility, male infants between 6 and 9 months readily imitate the gentle propulsive actions on a balloon, by patting it around, by same-sex models more than female infants, who don't seem equally fascinated by propulsive movements. The beginning of tribes. Pair bonds can also socially connect different groups, thereby opening the flow of cultural information and increasing the size and complexity of toolkits by expanding the collective brain. This effect occurs because pair bonds can establish enduring relationships between females and their brothers, fathers, and uncles. If females depart their home groups when they start looking for mates, they will often end up in nearby groups. As we discussed in Chapter 10, chimpanzee troops have hostile relationships with their neighbors. Such persistent hostile relations inhibit adaptive cultural evolution by constraining the flow of cultural know-how among groups. It constrains the size of collective brains. Now, however, when two groups with pair bonding encounter each other, sisters and brothers, or fathers and daughters, may recognize each other, and this affiliation may reduce the stress in such intergroup encounters. Moreover, those sisters and daughters may have pair bonded with a male and had offspring. Fathers and brothers can then identify their nephews and grandchildren, as well as the fathers of those nephews and grandkids, who protect and care for them. And it's probably best not to kill that guy. These social connections may permit groups to more comfortably intermix, potentially sharing things like water holes or fruit groves. Practices, tools, and techniques can flow between groups through the social channels created by family relationships. These newly expanded networks will increase the size and complexity of the repertoires of tools, skills, practices, and know-how. So, at this point, there will be more cultural complexity in the world, which means that larger brains can more readily pay for themselves because there's more to learn. Later, once our ancestors began acquiring packages of social norms that prescribe, extend, and reinforce behavioral patterns, pair bonds transform into marriages, and fathers into dads. Reference Chapter 9. Cultural evolution has even repeatedly enriched the relationships between a son and his mother's brother, which anthropologists call the avunculate. The avunculate is a special relationship that often helps link different communities. Nephews get special privileges to visit and obtain gifts from these particular uncles, and learn stuff. To emphasize an earlier point, social norms mean that, although these relationships are underpinned by some basic aspects of primate kin psychology, they are now also monitored and enforced by the community, by third parties. Thus, by intersecting with the know-how pathway, the sociality care pathway contributes to crossing the Rubicon in several ways. First, by expanding the kinship network, a combination of pair bonding and social learning both creates more opportunities for learning from others and fosters alloparental care from newly located relatives. Kin bonds increase social tolerance, which, by creating more opportunities for learning from others, fuels the cultural evolution of larger and more complex suites of tools and know-how. Such suites put an even greater premium on equipping individuals with the psychological abilities and motivations to be able to learn from others. Eventually, as skills get hard to learn, this situation opens the door to at least some simple forms of teaching, since we now have experienced individuals who recognize their relatives and have various incentives to invest in them. If nothing else, an offspring's kin network won't, and often can't, easily hide valuable know-how, skills, or food extraction techniques. Second, the care and investment provided by newly bonded relatives and those seeking to learn about infants allows mothers to more quickly get pregnant again, while at the same time allowing her offspring the time and opportunities they need to tune into the expanding body of practices, tools, techniques, and expertise that are becoming increasingly available. The result will be larger brains and the longer childhoods needed to fill those brains with know-how gleaned and honed through a combination of observation and play or practice. Farther down the road, of course, cultural evolution will shape social norms and deploy social technologies like rituals to establish and maintain expanded networks that link groups and individuals across large populations. Why living apes haven't crossed the Rubicon. Understanding the importance of group size, social interaction, and pair bonding for cultural accumulation helps us understand why living apes haven't crossed the threshold into a regime of cumulative cultural evolution. Gorillas, for example, do pair bond, but live in single-family groups with only one male and several females. These groups are too small for cumulative cultural evolution. Similarly, orangutans are rather solitary and don't pair bond, which means that young orangutans often grow up with only their mother to learn from. With little access to others for social learning, it's very hard to generate aggregations of cultural know-how. Chimpanzees are more group-oriented, but have a fission-fusion form of social organization that still means that young chips mostly hang around their moms. Studies of how infant and juvenile chimpanzees learn to use stick tools to fish for ants or termites show that young chimpanzees really only have access to mom as a model, 90% of the time, though when given the chance, they will watch others, usually older female relatives. Thus, the narrow evolutionary bridge across the Rubicon I've constructed begins with a large, ground-dwelling ape who is forced to live in larger groups, by predation, in which at least some members of both sexes have evolutionary incentives to pair bond. In summary, the key to explaining why our lineage crossed the Rubicon, and so many other species have not, is to understand how we solved the startup problem. Bigger brains, calibrated to rely on learning from others, can't pay for themselves unless there is already a lot to learn out there in the minds of others. So, assuming we are starting with a creature with good individual learning abilities, for example, big apes, we first consider the conditions that would favor increasing the amount of know-how one could potentially learn without increasing brain size. Terrestriality gives a boost by providing better opportunities for individual learning and more chances for social learning. Predation, by forcing primates to live in larger groups for protection, increases the size and interconnectedness of groups. Both terrestriality and predation will thereby increase the size of groups' cultural repertoires and may begin to push a species past the threshold. Nevertheless, expanding brains to store more cultural information still face a crucial obstacle: the high cost to mothers of investing in offspring, who take a long time to grow up and learn what they need to know to survive. Even when this pays in the short run for mothers, it can result in extinction in the long run when famines, droughts, and floods hit. Circumventing this constraint, the larger groups of social learners created by predation can also lead to the spread of pair bonding strategies, which eventually expand kinship circles, increase social learning opportunities, and favor greater alloparental care. Combined with the increased production of high-quality foods made possible by more cultural know-how, Due to more social learning opportunities, the alloparental help delivered by relatives and others to mom and her offspring lower her costs in the short and long run, which permits her to produce children more rapidly. This opens the door for a massive expansion of brains, increasingly selected for their cultural learning abilities.